try and bring stakeholders from the community together to discuss open access related topics. This is the last one before the summer, so we've got some more starting back in August. We'll not get any dates confirmed. So my name is Romy Beard. I'm the Publisher Relations Manager and Business Development Manager at Chronos Hub. So I've been organizing these webinars to get different perspectives, different people on the call to discuss various topics. So today we're going to dive into the topic of authorship data and discuss a little bit about how open access has made us as an industry and different stakeholders look at authorship data differently, and what the implications of open access are for that. So I've got with me today Miguel from Rockefeller University Press, Matthew from Rockefeller University, and Tyler Roos from Digital Science. Perhaps I can get each of you to introduce yourselves briefly before you really dive into the first topic around this. Miguel, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar today. So my name is Miguel, and I'm our sales manager here at Rockefeller University Press. And we're a very selective publisher that publishes 3 hybrid journals: the Journal of Cell Biology, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, and the Journal of General Physiology. It's particularly exciting to be here with Matt because we are both from the same institution. And we are very similarly, we are both departments of Rockefeller University, a very unique institute, high research institute here in New York City, where, by the way, it's a gorgeous day outside. it's a lovely summer, so it's nice to hear that we're capping the end of the sort of summer program. So I'm tasked with transitioning our 3 hybrid journals to fully open access journals. And you know, in my career in publishing, I previously worked in support and operations, and particularly I've emphasized data analysis. So I'm very much coming to this problem. You know, how does a subscription-based business become an open access-based business from that data mentality? And that's really what I'll be discussing throughout this hour.
Perfect. Tyler?
Yeah, Tyler Roos from Digital Science. I've actually been with Digital Science for just over 5 years, and it's been really exciting and interesting because we do a lot of different things with publishers across a lot of different portfolio companies that we've invested in and bring to the market. My general role is focused on dimensions, although I do talk a lot about altmetric, figshare, and Repeta as well. But today's focus, I think, will be a little bit more on the data that we have in dimensions as a database that does have a lot of authorship data and open access data in it that really enables lots of different interesting analysis, hopefully that supports the things like Miguel is doing. And then we'll dig a little bit into some of the different things you could do with the dimensions data as well. So, and I am based in Boulder, Colorado, so a little bit further west than everybody else, but it is a sunny and beautiful day here as well.
Back to New York City for Matthew, I take it?
Yes, I'm Matthew Kobe. I'm the university librarian at Rockefeller University. As Miguel mentioned, we're two peas in a pod. They are our publisher, and we are their library. So we work really closely in terms of making sure that our faculty have access to all the content, obviously, that they need. And one of those things that's important these days is open access publishing and read and publish agreements, and those things really funnel in quite nicely to the concept of you know, corresponding author and affiliations, because those are the metrics and determining factors we're using to work out who's applicably applied to our deals in terms of whether they can publish open access or not. So it's an interesting time to be in the library space and to be negotiating these deals and to be working with both the publishers and the metrics vendors like the folks at Digital Science with Dimensions to be able to nail this information down and make sure we have, you know, we can make the right decisions. So I'm excited to talk about this.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to hear you all dig into this in a little bit more detail. So the way we structured the webinar today is that we dive into 3 different topics. There'll be time for questions throughout and at the end. So if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will try to bring them in the conversation, or else we'll look at them at the very end if they don't fit in. So the first kind of topic that I picked out and really is a kind of a question to the 3 panelists, and they'll each get a little bit of time to answer it, is how open access has changed how you look at authorship data in your organization. Perhaps like how how things were done pre-open access and what's happened now and what those implications are. So I think to start us off, we've got Miguel first, please.
Awesome, thank you. So I thought the premise, the way that you phrased this, Rami, was very interesting to me. You know, what has changed? Why are we discussing author data in the context specifically of open access? So earlier this week, I was talking about this with our director, Susan, who has many years in publishing, and she mentioned that it is an interesting sort of context, because a lot of what we're going to be discussing here isn't per se related to open access. Publishers have had this data for as long as we've been publishing, of course, and we've been using it and looking at it, or at least we should have been, for as long as subscriptions have been the dominant model. Still, however, from the perspective of transitioning hybrid journals to open access, it wasn't until quite recently that we really took advantage of or understood author data, particularly as it related to the production of articles within institutions. So there are many activities this data can be used for, many of which we'll be discussing in this webinar. However, the movement towards open access has really necessitated that publishers interpret and analyze author data to enter into open access agreements, as well as to ensure their success. And because of this, author data has had a new life or grounded purpose. This process of interpretation is the process of applying affiliations to institutions so that authorship can be understood in the context of institutional production, as well as used broadly for business analysis. So there's a very immediate, publisher to library relationship here, as well as a top-level view of libraries constructing their subscriptions into open access and publishers doing the same. This is, of course, a different use than how an author might actually view themselves. In the example on this slide, this article's corresponding author has 5 affiliations. And that's top-level views. I mean, you could even view this as more affiliations if you are looking at department, since a lot of submission systems, in fact, have the department instead of the actual institute. This article is also a good example of the limitations of using corresponding authors, in that we as publishers, we yearn for something very simplistic and unified and easy to understand. And in fact, authorship is inherently complicated. This article, for instance, has 60 authors on it, with about 100 affiliations across those authors. So you can see one article opens up this entire data set that's sitting behind it. And that data set can be used for a wide breadth of activities. And of course, you really lose this complexity when you are focusing or only looking at the corresponding author. Now, affiliation data is often just as good as it is in the submission system where it's entered, as we all know. And this is sort of one of the fundamental challenges of looking at this data, because of course, if a system isn't designed to collect or understand or interpret data, it is not going to be able to spit out the data that you want it to. There's a quote that I really love, which is metadata is a love note to the future. And I reference this all the time because what it really means is that when you're designing something, and particularly when you're designing something to be used for data analysis, you need to precipitate future needs, needs that don't yet exist. And that's very much not something that happened with a lot of these submission systems, where they didn't think that this kind of institutional affiliation would be such an important part of what publishers do now. And now we have resolved this in our own system, because when we embarked upon a OA workflow, we began applying permanent institutional affiliations to every article through a ROR ID. In addition to that, we also apply a top-level interpretation, which really has purposes for salespeople or negotiators, the people that are actually talking with libraries. High research institutions can, of course, tend to have very complex organizational structures. And so part of this analysis is really selecting the highest level, even if that level might be ultimately an incorrect interpretation. And the reason for this is that it is always easier to remove articles prior to the beginning of an agreement than it is to realize halfway through an agreement that you never included articles from an eligible institution. Of course, like the number one canonical case here is a university like Harvard. Harvard has multiple hospitals. It has an institute that it shares with MIT. It has a million ways that the affiliation can come through, and the author has a tendency to put whichever one is most immediate. When we as publishers are sort of scoping Harvard's role in our publishing, we need to apply that top level so that we can go to the librarian with as full of a data set as we can, and then the librarian can simply mark off which ones are relevant. Of course, a huge part of this is evaluating the value of a read and publish agreement. And so it's really, really important and crucial to get this affiliation process correct. And so that's where we start from as publishers. How do we manage author data? How do we connect it to subscription data? How do we use it to model open access agreements? How do we use it to evaluate open access agreements? And ultimately, how do we use it to transform our business, just as librarians are transforming what the role of library is? And I think with that, I will hand it over to Matt to discuss a bit about that library role.
Thanks, Miguel. I think it's an interesting sort of two sides of the same coin environment where, as a library, historically, we were more interested in affiliation as a post facto kind of scenario where you were looking at information that your people were publishing as a metric that you might be reporting back to your administration or your research committees on what production was looking like at the university, what people were publishing, where they were publishing, how often they were publishing, those kind of things. So you were really looking at the authorship data in an analytic fashion after the fact. What's happened now as we transition to more transformative agreements and we have more full open access and read and publish agreements, that as a library, we're looking at author affiliation in real time. We need to know the people that are publishing in our institutions as they publish and the places they're publishing and how that relates to the arrangements that we have with various publishers and organizations, societies, that kind of thing, with regards to open access agreements and read and publish. So we've found in the initial deals that we've joined into or have entered into, that RightsLink, run by Copyright Clearance Center, has been very useful because obviously that gives us an immediate push to say, hey, this person with an affiliation to your university looks like they're going to publish an article with us. It looks like it may fit into the deal you've signed. Do you want to go ahead and approve that and put it through, or is there something we need to analyze further to make sure that the proper affiliations are being amended to it? We're also going to be joining in shortly with OE Switchboard, which I know that the press is a big user of, and it looks like a fantastic system to do the same basic idea, just hopefully on a larger scale with more of our agreements. So it really has transformed what the library looks at in terms of how we view authorship in real time. We need to have that access available to us. We can't wait for that information to go into a product like Dimensions or Scopus or Web of Science or any other database, bibliographic database you're using to backfill a CRIS system, or even if you don't have one, just you're doing those searches yourself. And then obviously later on you would get that information into your repository. But now, we're doing this as it all evolves and as it all happens. And the other side of this for the library is, as Miguel mentioned, it's how we look at entering into these deals. Previously, when we were just dealing with a regular subscription model, you were looking at how much value a journal had to you in terms of how much readership it may have had at your institution and usage. But when we start talking about read and publish agreements and open access, we need to be thinking about how much value does a journal have to our authors. It may not be a journal that's widely read necessarily at your institution, but it may be one you need to enter into agreement with because you have a large number of authors at your institution publishing in that journal. So you may find that while your people don't necessarily read it as much, there might be a number of labs that publish in a number of places, and by having open access agreements, you can leverage cost savings and be able to get better access all around. So it really is a interesting time where obviously publishers are taking this data and, as Miguel said, using it in their negotiations, and we as libraries have to now take that data and look at it ourselves and examine it in other ways, and then use it on our side of the negotiations to make our cases. So it's definitely an interesting switch in how we would previously view this as purely something that just was after the fact to now something that's a real-time piece of data that we need to jump on. And I think I can hand it over to Tyler to talk about how we would get.
Thanks, Matthew. So number one, I'll preface that I have 2 dogs and a cat, so we may have additional joiners at any time here, but we'll keep our eye on that. So I'm looking at this data all the way downstream. And so really having full authorship data is a little bit on a platform like Dimensions to be able to develop a data model that then isolates things like authorship and role and affiliation in meaningful ways, so that you can do different types of analysis at the aggregate level. So thinking about it sort of cross-publisher, cross-publication, cross-discipline, et cetera. So for example, with fully disambiguated author data, along with proper affiliation and role, it can be very simple to get a clear picture of how many publications are authored by researchers in a given year. And that can be looked at through the lens of a country or an institution or a consortia or even a system. So you can kind of really sort of narrow down that data and really make some sort of informed decisions based on that. With that data being the foundation of doing these types of analysis and reporting, it can then be easy to isolate those views by things like corresponding author, if that's of interest, if you really only want to look at the institutional affiliation and the volume of publications based on the corresponding author affiliation. You can then, of course, isolate that data as well by subject area, classification, topics. You can even look at it by the various types of open access publication itself. So as all of that data sort of coalesces into one data system, you can do a lot of really powerful things, again, at the aggregate level. One example shown here, I've got a sort of geomap, heat map visualization that makes it painfully clear as to which countries currently have the most publication output in 2022. So if you're really looking, again, just sort of at a high level, you could have a pretty interesting view of that. This is based on the institutional affiliation of the all authors. So again, you can sort of filter that down as to what you're really interested in looking at. But having that kind of data available to you is really key in looking at some of those emerging publishing models that really predicate on, absolute volume of publications based on the different sort of terms of agreements, et cetera. So knowing that historical publication data is pretty important in looking at the terms of deals, looking at also publishers, as Matthew, looking at partnerships, as Matthew had also mentioned as well. So the other example I have here, I think is really interesting, is that once you have clean data like that and you can really isolate all the authorship data and role, you can then overlay some predictive modeling on top of that. So looking at historical data and really understanding those volumes and where they're coming from, what institutions, what geographies, what consortia, you can then apply some really interesting techniques. Like the example here I have is the sort of institutional output in a particular discipline year over year, going back to around 2000. And what I did was I was able to take that data and then apply a model that said, where does this look like it's going in the future? And so with that, I can have an upward bound, an upper bound, I could have a lower bound, and then I can actually have an actual prediction. So not only looking at where that data has been historically and really sort of inform some of those decisions, I can sort of look a little bit out into the future. So having that clean data to make solid strategic and business decisions around some of these new agreements, but then also have a predictive model that lets you look a little bit into the future to see if that trend is going to continue, or does that trend change potentially based on the sort of historical data as well. Really helps you have all the data you need to make those decisions, enter into certain partnerships, and understand how to negotiate some of those deals themselves. So with that, I think we can move on to the next topic.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really nice overview, kind of high level overview, how things have changed in each of your organizations and as an industry as well. But I think you've talked about clean data, Tyler, and we've talked about how there's different author roles. So I think this is actually perfect segue into the next topic of a bit more detail around the corresponding author and author affiliation and different author roles. I mean, just today I was reading a paper about how the first author is the one that actually does the research and and writes up the paper, and the corresponding author is the one who submits it, but they're also the ones that trigger all these agreements. And I wonder what your thoughts are on these different elements and how they fit together, and what the challenges are with these, because clean data is obviously the holy grail, but as we talked about as well, like submission systems weren't like built with all this in mind originally, so we might not always have the clean data that we wish for, right? So I'll hand over, first of all, we've got again, Miguel to talk about your example around this. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting points raised. On the subject of clean data, I will say, I think clean data just doesn't exist. And I think it's actually a misnomer because I think data inherently needs to be interpreted. And so I think we often confuse interpreted data with clean data. But in fact, you know, anything that exists has a different meaning for whoever is looking at it. And so a lot of what, you know, what is clean data, like Dimensions is extraordinary clean data. Much of what is on this slide is produced from Dimensions, data that I pulled from Dimensions. But that clean data still has to be layered through my interpretation, what I want from that data. And I imagine it's somewhat similar with author roles. But I will say, I think we as publishing, as a broad industry, aren't really at the stage where we can do such a great job countering, you know, first, second, third role. I think we're still sort of bridging the difference between corresponding and everyone else. You know, the slide I had up earlier is good evidence of that, because that author on one paper had 5 affiliations from 5 distinct organizations. And the reality is that we miss that complexity when we're doing just a standard read and publish agreement, where we only look at one. And that is why I think Dimensions actually has been very helpful for us, because our submission systems, like I was saying earlier, are designed to capture that one organization. Whereas in reality, especially if we're modeling different types of business or different kinds of customers, we want to capture much of it. You know, in that case, that author could theoretically be eligible through agreement with the University of Paris, as well as APHP, which is a hospital system in Paris, as well as Rockefeller University, as well as Howard Hughes. So, you know, expanding affiliations to capture more than just one is a way for a publisher to incorporate many different options in their modeling. That's a bit of a tangent to the slide actually, because this slide is really just showing the sort of higher level analysis that we are doing as a publisher, which I imagine, you know, I've heard librarians talk about their own process of doing this as well. You know, pulling all of their articles and sort of analyzing how they get to the point where they want to get. You know, so a librarian could do this and say, you know, 90% of our output is published by 20 publishers, and we pay subscriptions to 15 of those publishers. So how do we get those subscriptions to open access? And like Matt was saying, that's not always simplistic. You know, there's all of these publishers out there that you may not have a subscription with, but if the library becomes the hub for open access production, they need to find a role to reduce subscriptions so that they can support those authors, which is an enormous shift. For us, as we sort of evaluate this shift, you know, I think what we see is a very sort of unique role for highly selective journals. You know, on this graph on the left, we sort of broke down our article production by average articles per year. And what we found is that, you know, 75% of our institutions that author with us have published 1 article or fewer. So we publish just 500 articles a year. So any given institution is really just not going to have that much of a role in the sense of publishing. You know, nobody's publishing 10% of our articles per year. That would be confusing if they did. There would have to be something going on there. The reality is that 75% of our authoring institutions publish 1 or fewer articles per year. So we inherently see this limitation with the corresponding author, because as many librarians have described, it's very challenging to negotiate an agreement where you're publishing fewer than 1 article a year. Challenging in a whole number of senses, but in the most basic sense, just to have the resources to do that is challenging. Which is why we've increasingly started to look at contributing authors as well as corresponding authors. And this is where the sort of Dimensions data comes in to the right, where we can see the sort of results of that analysis. Because we, as a hybrid publisher, are moving from the subscription to open access. What that really means is that we're moving from a subscription base to an authoring base. And what that means in the even more generic sense is we're moving from a big number, a fairly diverse number. I mean, we have very high level titles, but we have, you know, very low research institutions that subscribe to them. A big base of subscribers to a quite small base of corresponding authors. So on the right, we have 530 corresponding authoring institutions from the period I looked at, which was 2017 to 2020, compared to our 2022 subscribers, which are about 1,200, with a crossover of 410. When we expand that to contributing authors, we almost achieve a parity between the number of institutions that author with us and those that subscribe to us. Now, this completely goes back to Matt's point, which is that even when you pull in all of the authorship, there's just about 600 that cross over. So there's a whole catter of institutions that subscribe to our content, but do not author. And then there's a whole catter that authors, but do not subscribe. And so our sort of project is to bridge the difference. How can we find a sustainable role for non-authoring institutions? And how do we get a sustainable role for authoring institutions? I think at this stage, I'll hand it off. I talked enough about that.
Really interesting, Miguel. Obviously, when you move away to the full subscription model, you would look into not so much subscribers, but users, or where your users come from. Is that something you've looked at yet? Usage on open access content, at least, and where that comes from?
It's a great and it's a complicated question, and it's one that is complicated because like we're a small publisher. We have, I think, like 30 people on our staff, and I'm the only person who works on sales. So I'm covering the entire world, which, the answers differ everywhere you go. And something that has come up in the United States, for instance, is subscribe to open. What you just suggested is thought of as something that could have a role in S2O renewals, along with other output, where you send usage reports that are maybe they're geo-targeted. So you can go to New Mexico and say, University of New Mexico, you're supporting this S2O title, and this is how much use has been created as part of that. So I think there certainly could be a role for usage in some of these regions. But I think
I planned another webinar on that, actually. Sorry.
Good plug.
Yeah, I'll. Oh, my screen has kind of frozen. No, there we go. I'll pass on to Tyler then. Sorry.
Great. Oh, I told you my dogs were going to join at some point. So this slide I titled "Good Metadata Matters," but I think I'm going to change it to Miguel's suggestion of metadata as a love note to the future. So some of the analysis I showed earlier, which again is cross-publisher, sort of a whole universe sort of analysis, but what it requires is a couple of different things. One is metadata, right? So getting good metadata, full and robust metadata instead of clean. And then the second is having systems that can then isolate those different elements. So you really need to have a system that contemplates fields like corresponding author or first, second, third author or other affiliated authors, and then also multiple author affiliation. So it's really, in my world, it's about having that sort of data model that really is able to support all of those different elements in ways that make meaningful sense. So while technology can really help in things like disambiguation and making sure you've got a solid universe and knowledge of individuals, some of that metadata is really key to being able to populate those fields, and then having a system layer on top of that can leverage those fields. So for example, one key author data usage that we get is about outreach. And obviously that's a big component of some of these new publication models, as well as being able to know which authors you want to be able to talk to, invite to submit, et cetera. It also folds into finding peer reviewers and members of editorial boards, but really being able to understand and isolate, instead of at the aggregate level, now at the granular level, who are people that are interesting to you. And so you need to be able to match those based on the exact requirements of what your outreach might look like. And to be able to do that, you really need to understand the who, what their role is, and what their institutional affiliation is. That really sort of fits into that. So good metadata, or clean metadata, or just full and rich metadata is useful throughout the publication lifestyle, from start to finish. But as you can see from my example here, which is a publication record in dimensions, one of the things we're really trying to do is make it useful for individuals to be able to isolate and select individuals based on their role in authorship. And then obviously one of the things that we also like to provide is the ability to export this kind of data, so that instead of just looking at the individual publication record and looking at, from a traditional way of saying, okay, who was the corresponding author on this paper, it might be really interesting for an outreach program to be able to understand all of the corresponding authors from Stanford University who published in your discipline in 2021. So being able to really make that data usable is very interesting and important to us. In fact, one of the stories I like to tell is that when we first launched Dimensions, while we captured corresponding author, we actually didn't surface it anywhere. It was just a data point that we captured sort of in the back-end data model. And then after a while, as we realized there were more emerging use cases that really relied upon that, we made it available in a variety of different places so that you could really filter on that, isolate on that, and then of course understand who those were in sort of your overall analysis.
Thanks, Tyler. And next, Matt.
Yeah, I think we're talking a lot now about, at least in this section, about the cleanliness, quote unquote, of our metadata. And I think Miguel makes a good point that clean is somewhat of a misnomer, but I think Tyler also brings up the important point that richness is what we're going for. And so as a library, as we talk about corresponding authors and we talk about how it relates to these various publishing models, be it subscribe to open, what we consider a traditional, I'm not sure you could have a traditional read and publish agreement yet, given how short the span of read and publish has truly been. But we need to be thinking about, as librarians at least, and being sort of, if we're going to function as the hub for these agreements and for moderating open access on our campuses, that our faculty are fully aware of the value and importance of their affiliations, and that they need to be including, all of them, no matter how trivial they may seem to them. And I will now have a cat join as well. So that becomes a really important point for us, is that you get in a situation, the example that Miguel had, which was one of our researchers here at Rockefeller who does hold multiple affiliations. If he was to not list all of his affiliations because he may feel, this work was not related to one of the institutions I was working at, or it wasn't really inside the remit of what I'm doing there. If you miss that richness, then you're not getting a full accounting of what that person's activities are. And this also leads into considering it for both the corresponding authors, but also the contributing authors, as Miguel pointed out, because if we're looking at how we make cases for signing these deals or expanding the amount of content that we're providing to the world or accessing ourselves, we need to know who's doing what and where and when. And so, somebody that may be working in the lab for sort of what could be, a short period of time as a research associate, or in an intern type environment, or maybe a graduate student that passes through, in during their work. If you don't get a full accounting of what's going on in those situations, then you're going to lose that full story. And so I think for us, engaging with our faculty and making sure that they are fully aware of the value of their affiliation to everyone is an important thing that we need to work on.
Mm-hmm. One question I have is here, we talked a little bit about submission systems and how, they weren't built to capture all the information that we need. And sometimes there's a limit where there can only be one affiliation. And maybe this is a question for Tyler, like, where do you pull all your rich, clean data from? Do you use it from the actual manuscript? Or does it come from submission systems as well?
That's a great question. So we look to a variety and multiple sources. So primarily we can look at things like Crossref, which does have some data, but the most rich and robust source is going to be the publication itself with the affiliation data listed there. And so essentially we can just look through all of that data, but we are doing data mining in all kinds of different ways in order to track it down, because it is not in one central place. And in some cases it's different based on how the publisher workflow is in place and or the submission system that might have been used. So we found we had to invent a variety of different creative ways to be able to pull that data in.
we've got a question here as well from Heather Staines from Delta, I think, and she's asking if you know of any collaborations that are underway about industry standards or best practice around indicating this information in a machine readable format.
I can tell you from my perspective, the closest approximation to that is the JATS format, in terms of being able to really create and distribute JATS data, is probably the best thing we've got going for us right now, but that's just from my perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's, like Heather suggests, a lot of work that could be done to get the data clean, although we probably never get to where we want to be. But I think there's a lot of people that are thinking about all the various issues related to different author roles and multiple affiliations that can make that a little bit cleaner. So the next thing we wanted to dive in before we go to like overall discussion and any other questions is about different business models. We touched on that a little bit already. Miguel, you talked about subscribe to open and how you know, that business model makes you look at authorship data in a slightly different way. So we've still got a couple of slides from each one of you, one slide from each one of you to get through this last topic. And I think this is Matthew again, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. So as we sort of start to look at this and how we're changing the face of the models that we deal with, we also have to think about, at least from the library's perspective, how this influences our budgetary process. So, you know, traditionally, if you're paying a subscription fee to access a journal or a collection of journals from a publisher, you may be doing it through a consortium. You are just paying for that content, and you're making those judgments based on what the readership is at your organization, how much value your faculty places on individual publications. You're not necessarily focused on where their output is. You're just focused on the input they need to do their jobs, the information they need to synthesize as they're doing their research, and they can come up with their new ideas and can further their fields and do all those sorts of things. But as we start to look at subscribe to open models, read and publish, say PLOS's cap model, we start to look at how would this affect the library's budget, because it is unfortunately a fixed pot of money that does not increase at the rates that we wish it would. So we have to find a way to be able to cover these agreements, but also keep our content still at a relatively high level. So when you start to look at these new agreements where we're maybe doing a subscribe to open situation, or we're doing something like PLOS's cap, how does the money move, and where does that money come from? Because as a library, if somebody asks me to start paying for something that I didn't previously pay for, and obviously PLOS would be an example. I love the cap model. I think it's a potentially a great way forward, but it does come with some downsides when a librarian goes to their administration and says, look, I need to increase my budget by X amount to cover the publishing costs of this. This is now money that doesn't come out of the lab's pocket, but it would come out of mine. So is there a burden sharing agreement here where a pot of money is set aside to cover these agreements, and we can leverage that to pay for these things? Do we provide some kind of system where there's a shared cost mechanism? The labs pay some costs, the library picks up some of the charges, because that would be a sort of a burden sharing environment. Do we just kind of decrease the amount of things we subscribe to on the basis that more things are becoming open access, so we don't have to subscribe to as much content and pay for it in the way that we used to, because everyone is doing these kind of models? And theoretically, and I'm sure Miguel will talk about this as well, but theoretically that could be where we end up if everyone's paying for a read and publish agreement. From the library standpoint, then the information is free, so we're not worrying about our subscription costs. We're just worried about our publishing output costs. But I think, as Miguel's slide previously pointed out, that is a problematic way of dealing with the solution from a revenue standpoint for the publisher side. So I wouldn't see that being necessarily the way that things would move. So it's a lot of thinking about issues that we don't really want to think about because we just want to provide people with as much content as possible in it, and we think it should all be there. But we have to work inside the limitations of the systems we have, and unfortunately, that includes how we pay for things. So I think we need to start as a group, both the library side and the publishing side, working out how we're going to find equity in this environment. And I think it's easier for the smaller publishers than it is for the larger, more corporate publishers. And I think that's where the challenges are gonna lie.
Thank you. Miguel, you wanna talk us through this one?
Lots of really good subjects. It's hard to pick which one to focus on, I have to say. A nefarious reality. So if we go to ESAC, and if anybody's not aware, ESAC is this wonderful registry that is managed by Max Planck. I and a lot of other publishers spend a lot of time looking at it. It's a place that librarians can input the details of their transformative agreements. It's a limited data set because it's largely only used by predominantly European researchers, but there are agreements input by other people. And they do these really sophisticated market analysis that is really worth taking a look at, because one of the things that is actually, I think, becoming pretty clear is that there is a strategy adopted by the big publishers especially, but some of the small publishers too, I'm sure, where there is a bifurcation between subscription content and open access content. And so these agreements exist and they're growing their open access content, but at the same time, they're stabilizing their subscription content. So if pricing is separated with subscription content on the one hand, closed articles on the one hand, and open articles on the other, what is actually happening is that the overall production is increasing while the subscription is being maintained. So that's exactly the problem that you just described, Matt, where libraries have to incorporate new costs, but there isn't so much of a lowering costs when there should also be a lowering of costs. Subscription articles must become open content, and when they're open, the payment must be changed. So it is a funny reality to be in, and there is something that we share with that as a publisher, because like you described, money is an immovable wall. And when you're in a business, when you're in any kind of business, once money exists, it's really hard to get rid of that money. So if you have a revenue line, it's really hard to convince other people, we got to drop that revenue line, or we have to do a dramatic change so that we can come out of this in a more sustainable way. So it's a very complicated situation, and that's sort of what I was trying to get at this slide, is that when we're talking about author data, we can put all of these sort of activities, or the themes that we're talking about in these buckets. Models, which we've spent a lot of time talking about. The most fundamental sense, we need to understand author data so that we can communicate it and we can price it and we can create sustainable deals with libraries. And likewise, libraries need to be able to look at that. And that's probably true, maybe not probably true. My personal opinion is that it's likely to be true with most read and publish models. I'm sorry, most open access models. The reason being that kind of engagement is a really good thing for libraries and publishers to have. It's really good for everyone to understand how research is produced and disseminated and read and understood, and the whole holistic thing. The activities subject is really along the lines of what Tyler was talking about. And it really speaks to the benefit of using any kind of data system to pull data that you don't have. So if you go back to my earlier part, you'll remember that I said we publish 500 articles a year. And that's just inherently a limited data set. Even when you pull in the contributing authors, it is still a small data set. And so we really need to go to other sources like Dimensions or Crossref or whatever to be able to do a kind of market analysis that we could then use to actually transform our business. And we do use our own data for this. So we just recently started using our very defined affiliations to market open access agreements to eligible authors, both corresponding and contributing at institutions where we have free to publish agreements. So we just started this last month, so I can't really say whether or not it was successful or not successful, but just like Rami's earlier point, I think a lot of these marketing activities are very dependent on the region that you're doing them in. So I think if you're in a very saturated market like Europe, where maybe you're the 50th publisher that an institute has a read and publish agreement with, your marketing email is probably just gonna go by the wayside because authors have limitless opportunities there. Conversely, oh please.
Do you expect authors to, like, if you do marketing to all types of authors, also co-authors, do you expect that authors will change who will be the corresponding author because one of the co-authors might be eligible for a deal, whereas the person you might traditionally put down as the corresponding author might not?
That's a great question. One which I'm just like supremely unqualified. It's one of those issues where it's like, it's one thing that's interesting to me because, and you'll hear different perspectives on this. My background is not academic research. I've never worked in a lab, so I don't have that sense of like, how is this actually done? I study art history, so it's like a totally different thing. So I just, I think we'd have to talk to researchers and understand their perspective on their own goals. So I will say, as a publisher, I wouldn't have any issue with that. I think, if somebody wants to have an economic benefit that their library has provided to them, great. Hey, that's a good thing, I think, in the least essence of publishing. Matt, is he looking at it?
Yeah, I think we end up in a situation where there's a lot of tradition, I guess is probably the best word to use, around where authors are aligned in a publication. We do talk traditionally that the first author is the one that has done the most work, but obviously now we do see more commonly attribution being applied to larger groups. So you may say 3 people share, the same amount of work on a piece of research, so they're all contributed equally. So it's not quite co-first authorship because there's no way to really record that, but it is something that I think we need to start seeing inside of the fields, because to recognize these things and give people the appropriate credit given how valuable publications are to gaining employment further up the chain in academia. And that's a whole other kettle of fish. We could spend another a webinar on debating what's wrong with academic hiring policies. But I think we would need to look at how the corresponding author is controlled, because people have looked at that as a hierarchical system, and if you're the last person on a paper, people know, oh, that's the head of the lab that drove the majority of this research, is sort of how people would look at it traditionally. So it would require people to kind of divest themselves of the more traditional sense of the hierarchy of authorship, which would, I think, to me, would be a huge step forward in an equity environment. And then it wouldn't so much matter, and people could avail themselves of the economic advantages that these deals would be given, by different libraries. So, as Miguel said, I'm all for it. I just think it's a paradigm shift that people need to embrace.
Because I mean, the flip side of that question is, should those types of agreements be based on more than just a corresponding author? I know the plus cap model, it takes into consideration co-authors as well, and offers discounts to co-authors or institutions that have a membership. But I wonder if it's either going to be this, like, whoever is eligible is going to be the corresponding author, or if we look at expanding those agreements to also include the first author or co-authors in some capacity.
I will say it's a really interesting question. I think Matt's it's like a call to arms, and it's very persuasive. I mean, there are all these like hierarchical issues that from the side of publishing we just don't see, we're sort of vaguely aware of, but like Matt was saying, they can be really problematic, to say the least. I do think that all of authorship should be incorporated into business models, and I think that I think that PLOS did a wonderful job initiating this paradigm shift in a way. I think it's complicated and it's hard, and a lot of things have to change before we get there. Financial things in our case, we have to have transformative effects on our own business before we can get to the stage of having that kind of model.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've got one more slide from Tyler on this, if I can make this move. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'll continue the cinematic theme here, and we'll go from the multiverse into sort of a meta view of what's happening in OA publications, just to kind of round out the overall conversation. So we capture open access information in Dimension so that we can really sort of track and look at individual disciplines, individual publications, and how they've changed over time, just generally speaking, in terms of various flavors of open access, et cetera. And of course, we've seen growth overall in OA, and those are supported by goals around open science, funder mandates, and even these new sort of different models that are being explored, like that Miguel just went over. So it's great to see that growth, and it's great to see that in 2019, all forms of OA sort of surpassed the closed version of publication. So you can see that growth and momentum is just continuing on. And of course, again, that varies by discipline, et cetera, and was significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the amount of research that was made openly available based on the needs of the world at that time. But the other thing I'd call out is that while we capture various flavors of open access, those change all the time as well. So when you're doing analysis around how the authorship fits into what type of open access and what type of journal you need to launch or flip, and sort of what model it needs to support, it's just interesting to see how those will change over time. So various people have various definitions of what hybrid or green or gold means. And then, of course, there are new and emerging ones like platinum, et cetera. So as we get more and more, I think, attention and sort of the coalescence of tools supporting infrastructure, business models, et cetera, then we'll see some of those stabilize. But it kind of goes back to Heather's question there, is that there's a lot of variation and there's a lot of things that move. And so really having consistent data and consistent definitions and consistent sources of those data would be really sort of key as we sort of look at the overall growth in open access and how that changes over time, really around all of the different concepts we've been talking about today. So it was really great to hear Matt and Miguel talk about those different models from the different flip sides they have, and then how those sort of end up in a analytical visualization like I'm showing here that just sort of shows the last decade of changes in open access.
And Tyler, do you anticipate including like models like subscribe to open and track that in a different model? Like technically it is obviously the year that it's open, it's gold, but would you envisage expanding those groups and definitions?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, in that in addition to not just the flavor of open access, the flavor that the publication was published in, but also what the actual business model was going beyond that. And so then you can break apart OA not just as a publication method, but also as a business model. And that'll give you even more analytics to be able to track that. So absolutely. And so we'd be looking for that for sure. Yeah,
I think that'd be really interesting. And I mean, what's next ties in really with a question that Sandra has just put. I don't know if you guys can see it as well. It's really talk a little bit, and we haven't got that much time left, about the future. Where do you see the future of industry OA publications in terms of author affiliations, the future of OA journal subscription with commercial entities? We've talked already about the kind of emphasis on the corresponding author, but if you guys have any final thoughts in the last 5 minutes on where do you see things going moving forward?
I think Tyler's last slide is a perfect way to sort of wrap this up. And it goes precisely back to what Matt was saying, where, if you go back to that graph, the closed line is stable. So in a lot of ways, what is happening is that academic research is just exploding, and that more is being published, more articles are being published, and those somehow need to be absorbed into what publishers do as well as what libraries do. Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind is that open access is benefited by scale in a lot of ways. It's benefited when a publisher has a diverse portfolio that can incorporate a lot of different types of research, both broad and general, as well as like the selective stuff that we publish. And I think we're seeing this constantly. I mean, I forgot your name. But you were asking about the future of commercial entities, and commercial entities are certainly doing this. I mean, this is the reason why so many people have launched new open access journals in the last couple of years. It's why big commercial entities are acquiring natively open access publishers. It's because that scale really, really benefits the publisher. And you can see this, of course, in transfer titles. I was speaking to a researcher last week who was saying, that they don't see anything about publisher. They just shoot for nature and they pivot down wherever they end up. I think that's a quite common case. So there are things to be aware of as consolidation is just constantly occurring in sort of every aspect of publishing.
Any final thoughts from you, Tyler?
I just say the overarching umbrella of the goal of open research and open science supports everything. And I think that the new types of business models that are being made available, and as everybody transitions into what those mean and how they actually translate to successful operational and sales methods, really support that. So I see continued growth for sure.
Thanks. Matthew?
Yeah, I think I just kind of want to jump on to what Miguel was saying. We do have to start looking more at the other authors that are present on publications, and we can't just rely on corresponding authorship being the be all and end all as we try to mature these different models for access. So it's going to be a challenge, I think, moving forward to work out exactly what the equitable solutions out of this. And obviously, is the plus cap model the kind of thing we're doing where we're going to capture everyone's inputs and assign values to those, or are we going to do something else? So I think it's going to be an interesting time, but I think the corresponding author as we know it is probably not long for relevance.
The death of the corresponding author. I think
it could be coming.
It's in some of the other webinars, the same thing has come up. So one is kind of policy and making business decision and business models, and the other thing is workflow and putting it in practice and having good metadata, and perhaps we need more standards, like Heather said, around the different author roles and multiple affiliations, because I think, at least from a systems point of view, we know not everywhere along the workflow and in the chain of information is it being captured like exactly as it's in the paper, because there's limitation, obviously. So I think there's some work to be done there, but I hope everyone who's been listening has found it interesting as we dove into those kind of challenges around that. So thanks very much to the three of you for joining me today. I've really enjoyed that. If you want to join any future webinars, feel free to join the Corners Hub newsletter. The next webinars probably be looking at end of August. I've got a list of interesting topics, so hopefully be announcing those soon. Or if you've been listening and you're interested in taking part in any of the webinars, feel free to get in touch. Here's my email address as well. And this idea, actually, I have to give some credit to Miguel, because it was his idea to come up with this. I said, do you want to get involved in a webinar? And he's like, yeah. And I said, what do you want to talk about? And he said, open access and authorship data. And I was like, great idea. So thank you, Miguel, for that. And thanks for taking part.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Good day.